actually started praying, specifically praying to God for God's leading, both in our personal lives and for us as a church. For God's will to be done, seeking God's will. The next 3 months, during that time, having evaluation, also inviting those of you to be communicating with us the things that you were seeing in that time of prayer. And in the following 3 months, which we're just concluding now, that we, even as leadership, would be looking at all of those things, trying to examine those things, seeking God's will, and praying about that. Also talking with some of you at various times, and many of you still approaching us with things that you are feeling led by God to share with us as far as God's will for the church here. And so this has been the process, and drawing at this time, being the end of what would be the third quarter of Thy Will Discovery, this morning we have some things to present to you. David, if you want to go ahead and make your way up here. David Goff, of course, one of our elders, is going to present to you some of what we have received from evaluation. You remember we had Randy Garris here. Many had the opportunity to meet with Randy, to be with him. And so David is going to share some of the results of that and help to give us understanding as far as direction is concerned. And then I'll get back up following David. So, David.
Am I supposed to stand there? Can I stand wherever I want? That's my will, not God's will. Okay. Well, as Brad mentioned, several of you participated in a survey that was conducted by Randy Garris, and he compiled all of that data and sent it back to us. And I've got some things to say about that before we actually start looking at some charts. The survey resulted in over 250 comments. That doesn't mean 250 people participated in the survey. It just means that there were multiple comments made by some of you versus 1 or 2 comments by the other. Actually, there were a total of 279, but I said over 250. And they were organized into 2 major categories. The first category pertained to comments about things that you love about Parkview, the things that you would hate to lose. And the second category was things that perhaps we need to address, some hindrances that we might have in the congregation, as well as maybe some things that God is nudging us towards. And so we get this list from Randy of all of these various comments. If you went out on the street and you got comments from people around the community about what they thought about Parkview Christian Church, you would get that list and you would probably say, well, there's a lot of opinion there because they really don't know who we are. We chose not to look at it, as opinion because we feel that you are spirit-led people who prayerfully considered your responses before bringing them to us, and so there's a lot more weight added to that. Another thought is that the survey is a result of what you think of the congregation. It doesn't point to strengths or weaknesses of the staff or of the leadership or of any particular individual. This is a snapshot of who we are as a congregation. And so when you look at this data, please don't look at it and say, well, Brad needs to do a better job of preaching, or we need to do a better job of serving over here, or something like that. That's not what this is about. This is a snapshot of who you think we are, okay? In providing this compilation of comments, Randy had noted to us that he tried to reproduce the intent of each writer as accurately as possible when he was putting those into those 2 particular categories. And in a few cases, he said the writing was pretty difficult to read. He must have got a hold of one of mine. And he had to surmise the intent of what was the comment was. And in other cases, additional words had to be added to complete a thought. And so that was Randy's process of getting that information to us. The information that he gave to us is absent of any individual's names, so we can't look at a particular comment and say that person wrote that comment. And so your identity is secret and confidential. We don't know who wrote them. Along with that, we don't know the intent of the comment. We just take the comment as it's presented to us. So we get this big list of comments, 6 pages worth of stuff, and we're looking at it and we're going, well, what do we do with it? How do we present it to the congregation in such a way that they can see what is there? And so a process had to be developed in order to get to that particular point. Part of that is so that you can understand where we are looking at things, and also to give you a nice visual of what it represents. So a database was created. All the comments were entered into it, and then they were sorted so that like comments would come up together. Then a table was created to represent the various fields that were identified in these comments, and they were assigned a numerical value. And the numerical value simply represents the number of comments in that field. So if you had 10 comments about biblical teaching, the field of biblical teaching had a value of 10. If you had 2 comments about music, then the field of music had a value of 2. So that's the way that process developed. And then after establishing the fields and the tables, then charts were created so that you can visually see a snapshot of what is there. The charts are also presented in the form of a Pareto analysis. How many of you know what that is? I didn't think so. But a Pareto analysis is where you group data from the largest to the smallest. And so the largest fields would have the greatest number of comments, and the smallest fields would have the smallest number of comments. Clear as mud, right? So, John, if you would you put up the first chart? Now, I've got a handy little laser pointer that's not going to work, I don't think, because of the screen. But how many of you can read those labels on the bottom of that? Did you bring your binoculars with you? Well, thank John, because he has created some more slides so that we can see what all of those columns are. But this is a snapshot of this first category of things loved about Parkview Christian Church. There were a total of 113 comments in this particular grouping. And so here's the first one. It's loving, caring. So any comments related to I like the care that we give to others, or I like the loving attitude that we have. Any comments that had that type of terminology in it would be included in this particular column. And so there was 34 comments that would be the value of this particular field. And that represents 30% of all of the comments in this particular grouping. So John, the next one is servant. So any comments about service or about people serving would be included in that comment, in that field. And there was 12 comments in there. The next slide is biblical truth. And so there were 12 comments about how you like the fact that we go to the Bible, that we preach and teach the truth. The next field is acceptance. So again, when you think about you as an individual belonging to this congregation, how many of you feel accepted? How many of you don't? So that is something that we really strive for in this congregation, is to accept everybody. regardless of your social economic status, regardless of who you were or what you were, you're accepted here. The next field then is family. We try to teach godly family values in this congregation. And how do we do that? Well, the next field is leadership. We do that partly by the leadership that we have here. The next field is prayer warriors. We do it partly through prayer. The next is being friends. I mean, it's important not only to associate with one another because we wear the label of Christian, but it's important to be friends with one another, right? And so that's a distinction. The next one is one of the things that we strive to do here is missions. And then the next one is fellowship. And finally, the last two, the next one is location. There wasn't very many comments about the location. Maybe you don't like where we're at. But for the work that we do here, this really is a good location. I mean, for the type of things that we do. And then finally, the last on the list is music. Now, when we get to the next series of slides, you'll see that music is also listed as a hindrance. So what does that mean? Well, it just means that some people had comments about how they like the music, and some people had comments about how they think the music should change. And so that's, but this is a snapshot of this congregation. And if you look at the first 5 columns there, that represents 70% of all the comments that are listed here. And when you stop to think about it, that represents the heart of this congregation, because we love and care for each other and others. We do it by being servants. We base it on biblical truth. We do it with an attitude of acceptance, and we teach godly family values. That's who we are, right? So, excuse me, imagine if we switched that last column, which is music, for the first one. And music was the one thing that everybody liked, but we didn't have much love and care. What would that say about us as a congregation? So we can do all kinds of things with these charts. We could actually draw a horizontal line, say at 10, and go all across the page. And we could say that anything that falls below that line is opportunities for improvement. Those are things that we need to look at to improve. Anything above that line means that we have not only met, but we exceed the expectations that we set as a standard. But that's an arbitrary line, so who knows where that is going to go, right? So that's the snapshot of the congregation about things that are loved, things that you would hate to lose. So now let's go to the next. Okay, well, that's good because they're problems, right? No. So while John is working on that, the next series of slides, of course, is about possible hindrances, things that we need to address. Technology was one of those things that needed to be addressed, by the way. Things that God might be nudging us toward. And there were 166 comments in that particular grouping. That's 53 more comments than we had in the first grouping. And so you might think to yourself, well, we have more negative comments than we have positive comments. I mean, that could certainly be looked at that way. But the way I look at it is everybody was assigned the task of looking to see what God's will is for you and for the congregation. And so you're going to naturally spend more time, I think, in looking at things to address rather than things that you love. Because those things that you love are there naturally, and they will always be there for you, hopefully. But the things that need to be addressed, that's more of a dynamic. It's going to change from one period of time to another. In fact, even with a blank screen, our technology is still not not up and running, but if you would think back to the chart that we had previously, if we took the same survey next year, would that chart change? Maybe a little bit, but I hope by not a whole lot. The next series of charts that show those things that need to be addressed, we would hope that those would change, right? Because those are things that we would like to take care of. So how are we coming, John? Okay, so in that next series of charts, there is a total of 19 fields. The first series only had 12 fields, and that's because there's more comments. And just to show you that we wanted to make sure that everybody's voice was heard, the last 4 or 5 columns of fields only have one comment in it. But we wanted to make sure that everybody's voice was represented in the information that we provide. So while we're still waiting here, the major fields in that next series of charts was relationships and personal growth. We had the most comments about people wanting to have relationships with a certain segment of the congregation, or perhaps we need to follow through with some of the initial relationships that we create. And as far as personal growth is concerned, there were comments from people that would say, I would like to learn more, I would like to be able to do something different. That was the first chart. So that's what the second chart looks like. And I know you cannot read all of that. Maybe you can read a little bit more. But relationships was that first one. Personal growth was the second one. The third one was biblical teaching, which was ironic because in the first series were about things loved. There were several comments about how you love the biblical teaching. And then in this series of slides, there are those comments about we need more biblical teaching. So can we ever have more? Do we ever need less than what we have? No. We always need to strive for more biblical teaching. You can possibly read youth group under one of those, and right beside it is young families. And then it really drops dramatically from that point on. I think John is trying to create some labels for us here. But the point I wanted to make about this particular chart, I showed that the first 5 columns of the first chart represented 70% of the comments. Well, in this section, the first 5 columns represent about 60% of the comments. Why is that important? Well, when you have an elephant, how do you eat it? One bite at a time. You don't try to tackle it all at one time and take care of all of the issues. But with this particular chart, one of the things that really stood out to leadership was that we needed to become more involved in taking care of the youth and young families. And so Rick did a very good job of presenting to you how we believe that God's timing was very important in bringing Austin aboard as an associate minister. Because what does that do? Well, not only does it address the youth group and young families, it also addresses relationships. It also addresses personal growth and biblical teaching. And so by bringing on another staff member, we can actually address some of those issues and take care of multiple things at one time. One thing feeds another, and so it continues on down the line. The smaller ones down here, There was one comment about finances, and I think we could all comment sometimes on finances. We'd like to see more of it. But I think we do a tremendous job with the amount of finances that we have and the types of things that we do with the money that we have. And so that is a okay. I was looking to see if there was anything else. I think I've addressed the big stuff. All of these charts are available to anyone who wants to see them on an individual basis. We're not hiding them from anyone. This is a snapshot of who we are. And if you want to see more of that, then please get with me or one of the other elders. And we would be more than happy to go through it with you and show you all of that. I did want to tell you about a couple of comments that Randy made before I turn it back over to Brad. Randy said that it was an honor to read through all of the comments, and that was his comment, but it was an honor for us too to go through these and see that you really had a lot of thought going into these comments, and that you really think a lot about the congregation, and that you're really concerned about some of the issues that need to be addressed. And he also commented that he found them to be a personal encouragement to him, and he says the congregation does love Christ and the church. And so this presentation is more about you, the congregation, about who you are, what you are, the heart that you have, the things that you would like to address in the future. And I think that is all part of the Thy Will program. So.
Thanks, David. I want to mention, too, Randy shared with me a couple of things that I wanted to pass along to all of you as well. He said one of the things that struck him is the fact that we are where we are in growth as a church, in various levels of things, even just from what he saw in this, and that we are at this point looking for God's will for the future. He said normally when a church gets to the point of saying, God, what do you want us to do, is when things are really, really bad. And he said things are not really, really bad at Parkview. And he said you guys are already looking toward the future. And he said that is about 3 steps ahead. And Randy visits a lot of churches. About 3 steps ahead of the other churches that he's aware of is that we are at this point making an effort to seek God's will, to make sure that we are in line with God's will. And I really appreciated those comments, and I knew you would be glad to hear that as well. And that was one of the things that he walked away with. And a couple of other things that he didn't interject with, because this was, even as he expressed to us in this evaluation, for him to come in and say, this is what you've got to do. He doesn't know the church like we do. And so he wanted us to be able to do that. Just an observation. He said this, one thing that he sees within us is that in hospitality, that as a group, we are excellent. And that's seen in that, like that acceptance and the friendliness and the loving and the caring and all of that, that as a group, we are excellent. In hospitality as individuals, from our comments, our very own comments, we are lacking. And one of the reasons that happens is because when we collectively are very good at something, it's very easy to pat ourselves on the back that we're doing a good job with that. And so individually, we fall short. And it doesn't mean that everybody falls short in the area of hospitality, but that we can learn to make application of this better than we are making application of it right now. And so as we are approaching 2018, you may be looking at these things and saying, okay, here's a lot of facts, and here's the things that we see within ourselves that we don't want to lose, that we want to keep, and we want to maintain. And all those things being exactly the type of things that you would want to see representing Jesus here on this earth. And so as we see those things, then we see the things, okay, here's where we need to improve. And here's where we feel like God is leading us to improve. I mean, with all of that, so where do we go? We looked to this year thinking, is there going to be something major? Is 2018 going to hit and everything's going to change? And yet what we're seeing are changes that may be developmental more than just boom. One example of that, of course, and one that hit bigger was having Austin and Amanda and the kids here with us. And we presented to you the timing of that was not what we were looking at when we went into this as far as timing, not even knowing that having somebody else come on staff was God's will at that point. We were looking to see where God was leading us in that as well as so many other things. But feeling the leading of God in this because of how everything has come into place. And by the way, we didn't mention this in praise and in prayer, but just another one of those things that's fallen in place with all of that is they now have their house under contract in Richland. I mean, happened just super quick. But so many things lining up to say, yes, they need to be here. And so we proceeded with that. You proceeded with that as a congregation. Another thing that has been implemented, and we were just going to do it as a trial effort, but there was absolutely no negative, but all positive, to change basically the way we introduce communion together. And because there was complete positive feedback from that in just a trial effort to say, we're going to try this because of comments that were made and looking to leading on that as the eldership, let's try this. And so in trying it, there's been all good feedback, and so there was no need to wait until 2018 to implement this. But let's just go ahead. Well, you may be thinking, okay, what's left? Where do we go from here? There may be some classes coming. They may be some of we can utilize Right Now Media. How many of you are on Right Now Media? Raise your hand. I mean that you know you're connected. There's a lot more here that are already connected. You're already in there. If you want to get in, use it. If you haven't been and you don't know a password or anything like that, you haven't set one up, you can still do that. But we may use Right Now Media because we're finding that some of the online stuff, even as the Random Christ on Facebook Live, and most of you know about that, some of you don't even know about that. But it wasn't designed necessarily for this body here, but to reach out. And we're finding that people will utilize that when they may not come to a class. Because we're finding, I mean, when was the last time that we got 350 adults to a Wednesday night class? So we're continuing on with Random Christ because people are watching, people are listening, and they're coming back. Well, we're hoping maybe to utilize some of that even with training in hospitality. What do we mean by that? What does it mean to be hospitable? And how do we incorporate that to reaching others with the message of Jesus Christ? And so there may be those opportunities that are coming up. There will be some training. We may have to make some of them physical classes because we realize not everybody is going to have the access to Right Now Media where we can utilize, and these would be classes we would put together ourselves, not necessarily somebody else's. We can still use Right Now Media for that, or maybe just simply some of the other means that we have, even Facebook. Create a group and just do it on Facebook or something like that. But there's various ways we can do that, physical classes that may even be that going through a learning process and that training coming from the Word of God. Not trying to get away from this at all. Coming from the Word of God on what he would have us to do, he would have us to be in our culture, in our time, and letting people know we care about you. With all that being said, there's a lot of passages that we could have gone to this morning, and I realized there wasn't going to be a lot of time for preaching. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, in verse 4, after it's talked about us praying that we would live quiet and peaceful lives, and he says, which is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Father, it says, who desires all people to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. What is God's will? God's will is that all people would be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. Everything that we do, all the comments that we would make, all the goals that we would set, if we're searching for God's will, it is to get the gospel into people's lives. The gospel being the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Because when that is not just something that you read about, when it's not just something that you know, okay, this is what it is, but when it's something that becomes a part of your life, that because he did that, now you're doing that. That you die to self, being buried with him, that now you live a new life that he gives you. In a prayer that most people, even if they're not connected to a church, have heard or even said, that Jesus, in giving an example of prayer, when the disciples said, teach us to pray, he said, pray in this way. In the middle of that, Jesus says, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Thy will be done. That's a reason we're seeking God's will. Are you seeking it for your life? Are you seeking it for this body here? I mean, that's a question for each one of us to ask ourselves. Going into this wasn't a passage that I originally thought of. But it's in John chapter 7, and I think there's application of that for us today. That as we look at all of these things, as we contemplate them, as we as leaders have looked at all of this and already made the changes that we've made that we weren't expecting to make before 2018. Jesus is teaching, and in verse 14 of John chapter 7, it says, but when it was now the midst of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began to teach. The Jews then were astonished, saying, how has this man become learned, having never been educated? So Jesus answered them and said, so Jesus is addressing this question, this situation. Jesus answered them and said, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone is willing to do his will, he will know of the teaching, whether it is of God or whether I speak from myself. He who speaks from himself seeks his own glory, but he who is seeking the glory of the one who sent him, he is true, and there is no unrighteousness in him. Did you catch that? He said if a person is seeking God's will, they will know it when they hear it. Is basically what he said. They will know that I'm speaking of the Father if they're seeking the Father's will. I think we've entered that point in our process here. If you're seeking God's will, you're going to know it's his. Because that's what Jesus said. Praise team, if you guys want to come on up. The death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's the reason we're here. It's our only hope. Not using that hope in a way that the world around us would use hope, but a hope against hope, as God describes that Abraham had. That he believed God, and he reckoned it unto him as righteousness. That if you will believe him today, if you don't, if you haven't before, that you will believe him today, that you will say, I want what he has to offer, and I want to give it back to him. Because he's going to take your life that you're going to sacrifice, that you're going to take up your cross, that you're going to follow him, as Jesus said. But he's going to give it back to you to live for him. And that is the gospel. If you know it, then how do you share it with others? If you need to respond to that message, to God's will, come as we stand and sing together.